Hello, my name is Rifat. I'm from Team F. Today I'm going to present a webinar on upgrading iOS 9 to iOS 10. Here basically we are talking about upgrading the operating system of an Apple device, in this case of an iPhone 6 to iPhone 7. During this presentation I'm going to cover different parts in terms of the process of upgrading iPhone 6 to iPhone 7. When I say that, I mean hardware and software of this device. During this presentation, I'm going to cover 6 different points of the process of updating the device, in this case the iPhone. As most processes, I'm gonna start with requirements and preconditions of upgrading the device. We're gonna check what the device needs to meet, what conditions it needs to meet before the update is downloaded and installed, to make sure that the process goes smoothly and the device itself works smoothly after the update. So basically, I'm going to talk about the conditions that the device needs to meet. Then we're going to continue with preparations that have to be done in order to do the update. Then continue with backing up personal data, which is a very important step of the process. Then comes the main part of the process, which includes the actual step of upgrading processes and procedures. After the update is done, I'm going to talk about what happens after the update, what we should do after the update, the reviews that we have to go through, and this presentation finally will end with a discussion. I and my team, Team F, are gonna be open to questions where we discuss about different issues on this topic and the questions that you may have about details on this topic. When we receive an update, we usually get a message from the maker, the producer of the update, and we get some details to see what these updates includes. These updates we usually receive maybe quarterly, but sometimes it happens that they come more often, like monthly or maybe even more frequently, depending on the need and the demand for the update. Some devices, they send updates very slowly. I would say sometimes it happens that they do updates yearly. Some of them, they don't do updates at all. They just release the device with an operating system in it, and it stays as it is during its whole life. Apple, in the other hand, releases updates very frequently. I remember, I get updates maybe once in 2 months at least, where there are different reasons for the update. These updates can be very small fixes of different errors, performance issues, security holes, but sometimes they can be very big in terms of features and enhancements and designs, which can give you a whole different experience. When there are small updates, you can't even tell the difference between the previous iOS version and the new one. When there are bigger updates, you can tell maybe sometimes in performance, but also in the user experience itself, where you see a different design, a different way of operating, different menus. You just feel that something has changed in the new iOS version. It is always recommended to install the latest available updates, because this way you make sure that you have everything fixed as long as it takes Apple to fix everything they have seen, then you have that fixed. There are multiple ways of downloading and updating your device. You can directly download and install the update from the device itself, but what you can do is also download the update using your computer, where you basically connect your computer with a cable to the device, and you just kind of identify the device from the computer and download the update. For this process, I'm going to talk in the next slide, but just keep in mind that we have two main ways of downloading and installing an iOS version: directly from the device, and the second way is through iTunes or the computer. Before we start the process of updating, we have to consider a few things. We have to start from the hardware itself to make sure that the device can handle the newest iOS version, the new update. What happens most of the time, Apple itself limits us from updating our device if we don't meet the hardware requirements. Say, for example, if we have just 1 GB of RAM, then we won't be able to install iOS 9, just an example. Or we don't have enough storage, then we can't install iOS 9 because the update file will take some space, and if we don't have the storage for that file, then we can't even download it. But sometimes, even if we don't get some kind of a message or limitation from Apple, we should consider that when we install the newest update, the device will use more resources to kind of work with that update, with the newest iOS version. So it is always important to keep in mind that we have to meet the hardware requirements, and at least the minimum. Even though with the minimum we don't expect the device to work very, very smoothly with the newest updates. But if we go beyond that, then it's even better, because we will enjoy the newest enhancements and fixes from Apple. The second thing that we have to check before we start our updating process, it is to make sure that the current software, the current apps that we have installed in our device will work in the newest iOS version. Why is that? This is because sometimes apps are not able to work with newest iOS version, and they don't get updated, so they are basically stuck with an old iOS version. In this case, if we install a new iOS version, then we will not be able to use the old apps anymore. So just to make sure that all apps support, for example, iOS 9, it is important, since if we need those apps in the future, then we'll have to downgrade and go back to iOS 8, for example, just to use those apps. The third thing is to make sure that iTunes application has the latest version and is properly configured, but also iCloud should be configured as well. This depends on the way that we choose to install our iOS version. If we decide to install it through the computer, then we should make sure that iTunes is actually installed, it is updated, and is properly configured to be able to start the updating process. If we are installing the iOS version from iCloud, then we should make sure that we are authenticated to iCloud and iCloud is properly configured. So if we decide to install our iOS update from iTunes, we should establish a connection of the iPhone to iTunes through the computer. We basically use a cable to connect our device to the computer. Then when the computer recognizes the device, a message will pop up to display that. Then what happens is the synchronization process will be done to kind of recognize, to make a handshake between the iPhone and the computer to make sure that both of them are at the same step. Then what happens is if we are using iCloud, for example, to download the update, then we should just establish connection to iCloud and make sure that we are properly authenticated and ready to start the process. Before actually we start the process, it is important to back up our personal data from the device. Why do we back up our data? Even though the update process should not damage the data or delete any personal files, we should still make sure that our data is safe, in a safe place. For example, if it happens that the update goes wrong, there is some error, or the device is out of battery or something like that, then our data will not be safe in the device itself, since the system can get corrupt and maybe delete our data. So what we do is we create a backup file which we can restore later in case something happens to the device. There are basically two ways of backing up data. We can back up our data, save our backup file locally somewhere in the computer, or we can store it in the cloud, in iCloud in this case. Personally, I recommend to do both backups, to perform both of them. Why is that? Because in case we lose the device, the computer, then we have our data backed up somewhere in the cloud. If we lose access to the cloud, then we have our data backed up to the computer itself, locally to the computer. So we should always make sure that we have this redundancy of the backup process. We have our data saved in two different locations other than the device itself. We have it locally in the computer and somewhere in the cloud. This way we'll make sure that our data will be at least safe, and just in case something happens, we can always retrieve it. Okay, so there are two ways of updating the iOS version. One of the maybe the simplest and the easiest ways is to update it directly from the device itself. What we do is basically we go to settings, then select software and update, then we tap to download and install. After we do this, we'll see a progress bar getting filled, and we wait for that bar to get filled completely. Then it indicates that the update has been actually downloaded and installed, and it will give us a message that that the device has been successfully updated. In case something goes wrong, what we can do is we can connect the device to the computer and try and update it through iTunes. So, updating the iOS version through iTunes is a second method, is another method of doing it. This, I think, is a little more time consuming than updating the device from directly from the device itself. If we need to update it through iTunes, what we need to do is connect the device to the computer through a cable, make sure that the device has been recognized by the computer. After that, we just select the device in the upper row of buttons in iTunes to make sure that we are working with the right device. We create the backup, which I previously talked about. We click the check for update button. After that, we click if there is an update available, then we will be able to click download and update. If it's not, then iTunes will give us a message to say that you have the latest iOS version installed and there is no update to download. After we click download and update, in case there is an update to get downloaded, then we'll get the progress bar getting filled. We wait for that process to be finished. Then basically after that we have the latest iOS update installed in our device. After installing the update, there is one more thing to consider to make sure that the update will run smoothly and there will be no problems that can be caused from this process. There are two main things that we have to look at after we install the update. One of them is previously we mentioned that sometimes apps may not work in the newest iOS version. This we can confirm after we have installed the update. We have finished the update. What we can do is we can test each of the apps that we use in our device, in our iPhone in this case, to make sure that all of them are working. If they are not working, then it means that iOS they can't support the newest iOS version. If we really want them to work, then we have to downgrade to the older iOS version. Otherwise, we'll be left without being able to use those apps. Sometimes those apps get updated after the iOS has been released, so it may be worth sometimes to wait for those apps to get updates. If they don't get updates, then it means that the company who made them are no longer interested for the users of the new iOS version. The second thing that we have to check after the update has been finished is to make sure that we still have enough space or storage in the device. This may be an issue because when we download some update, it will come in the forms of files and take space in our device. It can sometimes take more space than it used to before, because when Apple adds new features, new menus, new enhancements, it means that usually they take more space. And if we don't have enough space, that may be an issue because the device may not run smoothly, or we may not be able to save pictures or other kinds of files to our device and run in situations where we are not able to save anything to our device anymore, which may be an issue. In case that happens, the only option is to kind of clean our device from these update files, maybe even downgrade to older iOS versions which they take less space, so we can still use the space left. However, today space is not an issue anymore, most of the time I would say, because today's devices have enough space integrated in them. You may have 160 gigabytes, which is, I think, more than enough in most of the cases. But if you have a 8 gigabyte or 16 gigabyte device, then that may be an issue, and we should always make sure that we have enough space to operate correctly. Otherwise, we can run into problems. This was basically my presentation, my webinar on the topic of upgrading our iOS version. I would like to end it with a discussion. If you have any questions that you on this topic, I would be very happy to answer. So let's continue with questions. Thank you for your attention.